All right. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. I'm Kevin Murphy with the Office of Water Programs here at Sac State, and I want to thank you for attending our first of two Spring 2023 Water Seminar Series presentations. We are a training and research organization with a focus on water quality and water resources, and we annually host two fall presentations and two spring presentations. So following suit, we'll have one more presentation this spring, where Jay Lund will be talking about capturing and managing large storms in California. I also want to point out that all the presentations we host are recorded and can be accessed via the Office of Water Programs website. So for today's presentation, it'll be approximately 40 minutes long. So we should have about 15 minutes left for questions at the end. Please submit questions by emailing them to the email address currently showing on the screen. That's seminarquestions@owp.csus.edu. So you can either take a screenshot, or if you look at the chat line, that same email address is provided. Now, I want to welcome Rich Drusich, who will be telling us about the state of the Colorado River and its relationship with California. Rich is a principal engineer with the Colorado River Board of California, where he leads their work in the study and evaluation of Colorado River water and power resources as they pertain to California's interests, as well as their evaluation and or development of Colorado River water resources projects. As many of you know, Rich worked for the California Department of Water Resources for over 20 years, and his assignments included implementation support for California's historic Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, the California Water Plan, DWR's initial CalSim Water Management System Planning Model Development, and work with local agencies to develop conjunctive management programs. Rich is a registered professional engineer in California with an MS from UC Davis in hydrologic sciences and a BS from Cal Poly Humboldt, formerly known as Humboldt State, in environmental resources engineering. For you folks that live in the Sacramento area, Rich will be speaking in person at EWRI's Sacramento chapter gathering on the evening of May 11th at the California Natural Resources Agency. And with that, I'll hand it off to Rich.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. I want to thank both you and Ramsey for giving me this opportunity to talk through the Office of Water Programs. I really appreciate it. I am going to share my presentation here. And if you could let me know, let me pull it up here.
We can see it, Rich.
Okay, I'm trying to, is it in presenter mode?
No, it's there you go.
How about now?
You're good.
Okay, so let's get started. Again, thanks for the opportunity. So I'm gonna talk a little bit on the paper I actually developed. It was published last year in the Journal of Water Resources Planning and Management. I put the link to the article in the chat. It's shown here as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is really based on that paper. I'm not going to go over everything that was included in the article, but we'll highlight some of the things. So talk a little bit about my agency that I work for, summarize some of the key challenges we're facing in the basin today, and then talk a little bit about a big focus of the paper was on the decision-making process in the basin. So I do want to hit on that. And then also talk at the end a little bit about the response to the current crisis. As most of everyone is aware of, the river is really at its kind of lowest storage on record right now. And before we got this series of wet storms or storms this winter, we were really looking at hitting dead pool in both the main reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And so it's very concerning. I think this winter has helped us avert the immediate crisis, but there's still some long-term challenges in the basin, which I'm going to get into. My focus is really going to be on the kind of the institutional processes in place for governance in the basin and some of the key challenges. In terms of where I work, so the Colorado River Board of California is a really small state agency. We have 11 full-time employees when we're fully staffed, and about half of those are kind of on the technical side, and the other half are on the administrative support side. We're actually funded by the 6 local agencies you see here in the slide. So we don't use any general fund, state general fund at all to operate our agency. Our day-to-day activities are really revolved around tracking the different management items in the basin, working across the 7 basin states. And so we are interacting really almost daily with the other 6 basin states. We do serve a board, so it's a 10-member board. 8 are appointed by the governor. There are 2 public members, and then also a representative from the California Department of Water Resources and California Department of Fish and Wildlife also serve on the board, in addition to the 6 water agencies shown here. And these are the agencies that either use water supply or power or both from the Colorado River. In terms of the challenges, I'm gonna, for this presentation, I'm really just gonna focus on the current drought and climate change issues in the water use side of things. These other topics are dealt with in the paper if you want to read some more on that. But just as a backdrop, the Colorado is one of the most overallocated and highly managed rivers in the United States. And it just is continuing to face challenges from growing population. The basin is one of the fastest growing regions in the country, and then also just the changing climate that we've been experiencing. And then, you know, just to kind of put that in context, it is an overallocated basin, and kind of one of the symptoms of that is the river no longer flows and hasn't flowed to the Delta and the Sea of Cortez for many years now, except under really extremely wet conditions. And, you know, that's a sign of both the changing climate and also just the overuse within the basin. And then this figure gives kind of an overview of the basin as a whole. For kind of management purposes, it's operated as kind of 2 separate basins. There's an upper basin and the lower basin. The upper basin includes what we call the upper division states of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. And then the lower division states include Nevada, Arizona, and California. The Colorado River itself flows from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, and that's over 1,400 miles. And it supports the supplies and uses support 40 million people in the U.S., and then also supplies agriculture. So there's 5.5 million acres of agricultural irrigation in the U.S. and another 500,000 acres within Mexico. And the figure here, I've just highlighted some of the key facilities on the river. So the number item 1 there, the triangle there, that's the location of Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell. This is at the kind of the bottom end of the upper basin. And it has a capacity of 24.3 million acre foot. Lee Ferry, which is just downstream, is the dividing point between the upper and lower basin. And just a little bit of trivia. So Lee Ferry, which is the dividing point, is located about 1 mile below the mouth of the Paria River. There's another location called Lee's Ferry, which is located upstream of the Paria River, and that happens to be where the stream gauge is located. So a lot of the information you'll see in this presentation is based on the Lee's Ferry stream gauge location, and not to be confused with the actual dividing point within the basin. Further downstream from Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam is Hoover Dam in Lake Mead. That's the kind of number 2 here on the plot. That reservoir has a capacity of 26 million acre feet. It's also the location of the diversions for southern Nevada. And then following downstream is Parker Dam in Lake Havasu, and that's the location of the diversions for the Colorado River Aqueduct, which serves the south coastal plain of California through a metropolitan water district of Southern California. And then it's also the diversion point for the Central Arizona project, which supplies Phoenix and Tucson, among other areas, and also various agricultural users. And then finally, as you get towards closer towards the border with Mexico, you have Imperial Diversion Dam, which is a diversion point for the All-American Canal. And that's the diversion point for irrigation of agriculture in the Imperial and Coachella valleys. So those are just some of the key features within the basin. In terms of supply and use, this figure shows the historical supply and use in million acre feet. The orange line is the uses, kind of a moving, there's a 10-year moving average, is the thicker orange line. And then the blue line is a 10-year moving average of the supply. And kind of what it shows here is, you know, starting in around the turn of the century, 2000 or so, it's really when we started to exceed the available supplies. And I'll show some additional information on this to kind of highlight the issue. And this is existing supplies, not including, you know, there's some unquantified rights for tribes. There's obviously some environmental requirements that are not specified here. So it just highlights that it's an over-allocated basin. And then looking at the current drought, so since 2000, we've really seen a 20-year period of well below normal flows in the basin. And then this plot tries to put that into context. Typically what reclamation does and what engineers in general will do is they use the historic record when we're looking at water supply studies. And in this case, our historic record is 1906 through 2021. And this graph shows the natural flow at Lee's Ferry, and it's looking at the average based on these different year periods. So from 1 all the way up to 22 years, looking at like a 22-year segment or a 10-year segment. And so these colored dots here are showing the end year of that 10 years. So the kind of purplish one is the end year would be 2009. So that's 2000 through 2009, that, for example, for that 10-year period, if you're looking at a 10-year period. And just what I want to highlight on here is if you do look at that 10-year return period, both the 2000 through 2009 and the 2012 through 2021 are the driest 10-year period within that 100+ year record. And so, and you can just see that kind of across the board that the last 20 years that we've been facing is really the extremely dry compared to what we've seen in the historic record. And it's gone so far that, you know, recently we've switched, or reclamation, I should say, has switched in its planning studies. Instead of using that full hydrologic record, 1906 through 2021, they are now using a much compressed hydrology, and often they'll use what we call the stress test hydrology, which covers the 1988 through present period. And although we called it stress test at the time, it really has become kind of like the new normal for us in terms of operating the basin. And this figure puts the current drought in context with the paleo record. So we have these at the bottom of the chart here. There's different sources of paleoclimate data. So stretching back to the year 800, 762 through 2005 is this record here. And it shows that the top part is showing the 22-year rolling average of those paleo records, and then the kind of the line across the bottom is our current natural flow at Lee's Ferry value, average value for those 22 years. And then similarly at the bottom is the 10-year rolling average at Lee's Ferry. And it just shows that these last 10 or 20 years have been the driest or some of the driest that we've ever experienced in the basin, even if you go back to 1,000 years. So it's just very extremely dry. And I think the implication is there that it's a changing climate, and that we should expect that dry conditions to continue, and not expect that we would get back to those wetter periods we had in the past. This shows the storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The blue is Lake Powell and the orange is Lake Mead. And you can see we had in the kind of late or early 80s, both combined storage was for both is up around 50 million acre feet, which is a lot of water. And then we had a little drought in the 90s, and then again we peaked up in the late 90s. Again, we were up pretty high, but since the kind of the late 90s, storage has just really fallen off, in part due to the dry conditions, and also the fact that the demands basically stayed the same. So we weren't really adjusting demands. We were kind of living off that storage. So today the combined storage is around 12.7 million acre feet, which is about 25% of capacity. And to put Lake Mead into context, when it's full and it's over 26 million acre feet, that's about 5.5 or 5.7 Lake Shastas in a full Lake Mead. And that's also about 7, I think it's 7.4 Lake Oroville's in Lake Mead. So it's huge storage, but it's come down quite a bit. And this is a little complicated figure, but I did want to show you it shows the Lake Powell end of month elevation. So on the left y-axis is the pool elevation, and on the right axis is the storage. Each of these traces, there's 30 traces based on different scenarios of inflow into Lake Powell based on the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center projections. The green dashed line is from what Reclamation refers to as its 24-month study. So it would be the most probable inflow scenario. And it shows how the operations of the reservoir would look. And then the blue line is a maximum probable inflow scenario. And then finally, that red dashed line is the probable minimum inflow scenario. And then the main take home I want to point out here is that it does look, the elevation 3525 on the left here is the kind of the borderline between the mid elevation and the lower elevation balancing tier. These are different operational tiers in the reservoir. So that 3525 is considered a critical elevation for Lake Powell. It's kind of a buffer between the minimum power pool. So the minimum power pool is at 3490 elevation. And so the thought is to try to protect the reservoir from falling to that minimum power pool. And so it looks like particularly with this year's wet winter, that at least Lake Powell is going to come up above that critical elevation of 3525. Even under most traces by at least the end of 2023, it's above that elevation. There's a little bit more uncertainty about what happens in 2024, but in general, we're looking a lot better than we were just 4 months ago or 3 months ago. And then a similar plot for Lake Mead. So Lake Mead is much less responsive to this wet hydrology because it's entirely dependent or almost entirely dependent on releases from Lake Powell. And due to the rules of the river, there are restrictions on how much could be released from Lake Powell. Generally, it's between 7.5 to 8.5 million acre foot release from Lake Powell, unless there's either really wet, so wet that you're spilling, or they do what they call balancing releases, in which case there could be some higher releases. But in general, it's a fairly narrow band of releases. So that's why you can see the lines for Lake Mead are compressed. What this shows is on the left here, you'll see these different shortage conditions. So as soon as Lake Mead hit 1075 elevation last year, I believe, or maybe it was 2021, we hit into what we call level 1 shortage condition. And so some of the lower basin states were required to take shortages then. We've fallen further below into what we're currently in this level 2 shortage condition. And then if Lake Mead falls even more below this 1025 elevation, and then that would trigger additional cuts within the river. So we do have some cuts baked into the system right now, but as we'll see, they're just not enough to deal with the current drought that we've been facing. Okay. So that's kind of a summary of the hydrology and the supply conditions. I do want to shift gears a little bit and talk about governance and decision-making in the basin. In general, I mean, the ultimate decider for the lower basin particularly is the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation. So they own and operate Lakes Powell and Mead. But there's also a kind of a stakeholder-driven process to manage the system. So it's not just, reclamation operating in a vacuum. There are processes to work across stakeholders to make decisions. And so that's what the rest of my talk is going to really focus on. It's important to note that so the river is managed under a really complex set of compacts, federal laws, court decisions, decrees, contracts, regulatory guidelines. Collectively, these are all known as the law of the river. And getting into the details of the law of the river is really a separate presentation. In fact, there's even a number of books out there that just talk about the law of the river. So my presentation is really going to focus on the programs that are in place to manage the river and how that's done on a kind of a day-to-day basis. And what I'm showing here are these kind of 4 different topic areas. So I've chosen to, and in the paper, it talks about these 4 different areas. So there's really what I call joint upper basin, lower basin. So that's really the entire basin and decision-making. There's some decisions that are made strictly from the upper basin, some that are more focused on the lower basin. And then of course, there are binational decisions between the US and Mexico. This is a list. I'm not going to describe all these in detail, but I'll go through a few of these just to describe what they are and kind of the decision-making process behind each of them. In terms of basin states, so when I refer to basin states, that's really the 7 basin states, and it's a fairly informal, or from my perspective, kind of an ad hoc group that's the same people. So there's official state representatives authorized by each governor, but they don't have a specific schedule of meeting. It's not like a river commission or something like that meets regularly to discuss a myriad of issues. Really, the basin states get together when there are specific pressing needs. And for example, with the current drought we've been facing, there have been meetings sometimes, weekly amongst the basin states to try to hammer out different agreements and discussions to move forward. But it is, from my perspective, a fairly ad hoc approach. Another one of the main programs governing the river is the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. This is key purpose of this is really to help improve conditions for Grand Canyon National Park and Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. Decision-making and decision support occurs through the Adaptive Management Work Group. This is a federal advisory committee. And there's a number of different stakeholders and interests that are involved and participate on that work group. One of the items this group has known that you've probably all heard about are these high flow experiments in the river, where they will release a high flow through Glen Canyon Dam to improve the sediment conditions below into Grand Canyon National Park. So that's something that gets a lot of press every year when you see these high flows, and that's what this photo is showing an example of that. Another program is the Colorado River Basin Salinity Control Program. So this is really focusing on total dissolved solids in the river and really trying to reduce damages to the lower basin that happen when you have higher TDS in the river. The figure here shows in general from the upper basin to the lower basin how the salinity changes. So the blue colors are more of the fresher water, and as you get down towards the bottom of the basin, it turns a little bit more highly salinity water. And then the size of the stream here is indicative of the actual flow in the river at these as it moves downstream. And it's hard to see in the graph, but there are some tributaries to the Colorado River that are highly saline tributaries from natural conditions, natural soil and land processes, so and just the geology. And so some of the activities that the control program looks at, its salinity control program, is to how do you address some of those natural salinity issues, and also salinity coming off agricultural lands as well. In terms of decision making, this occurs through what they call the Salinity Control Forum, and there's also a companion Salinity Control Advisory Council, which is a federal advisory committee. And the governors of each of the 7 basin states appoint up to 3 members to serve on the forum and the advisory council. And I wanted to highlight that there's also separate laws and processes for managing salinity in the river as it crosses into Mexico. And so those are managed by Reclamation in conjunction with the International Boundary and Water Commission, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Responding to drought. So that's one of the key activities that are we're all involved with these days on the river. Generally, Reclamation is taking the lead on that. The 7 basin states are also involved in that, and also the different stakeholders as well. I kind of refer to this photo as like the mission accomplished photo, because back in 2019, we all thought, okay, we just signed these drought contingency plans. There was one for the upper basin, kind of covering upper basin activities, and another drought contingency plan for the lower basin, which specified additional cuts that the lower basin would take under dry conditions. Everyone's kind of clapping their hands here, but then we had 3 of the driest years on record after this signing, after this came out. And it quickly became clear that the DCP was not sufficient to address the dry conditions in the basin. So we're all back together now, again, trying to face this current crisis. In terms of upper basin decision making, there is an Upper Colorado River Commission, and it was established by action of the upper basin state legislatures and also Congress, and it was part of the 1948 Upper Compact, Upper Colorado River Basin Compact. So 2 key roles for this entity is to ensure that the appropriation of water within the upper basin is done within those 4 states. The water is allocated among those 4 states, and it also ensures that water is released from the upper basin into the lower basin according to the compact requirement for 1922 Colorado River Compact. And in terms of decision making, it's comprised of 1 representative from each of the state, from each state appointed by the governors of those states, and then also a member appointed by the president to represent the U.S. In the lower basin, I'm just going to highlight a couple key areas. One is really looking at Secretary of Interior as the water masters, and then also the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. So as the owner and operator of Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam, Reclamation is obviously a key player in managing the river. Under the Boulder Canyon Project Act of 1928 that authorized the construction of both Hoover Dam and the All-American Canal, the Department of Interior is the sole contracting authority for the Colorado River in Arizona, California, and Nevada. So all roads lead through Interior and Reclamation. In practice, Reclamation does work very closely with all the stakeholders in the basin, including the basin states. And part of that process is annually what is called an annual operating plan is put out that looks at the operation of Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam and the different triggers and rules that are in place for the next year, the current year, and then the year ahead. And those are all laid out, and it's a very widely established process for vetting with a number of stakeholders involved in the basin. The next one is just the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. So this is a 50-year program looking to conserve 27 species along the Lower Colorado River from Lake Mead to the southerly international boundary with Mexico. And the goal is to improve the aquatic, marsh, riparian habitat that is vital to these different both resident and migratory species, including birds and fisheries. And this is done through there's a number of wildlife refuges and programs looking at improving those conditions. In terms of decision making, there's, again, this is led by Reclamation, but there's a steering committee that's involved with those decisions. And last check I had was there's about 57 different entities on that steering committee. So you can imagine what a challenge that is to get all those different entities on the same page. And then binational decision-making between the US and Mexico occurs through the International Boundary and Water Commission. It's a binational body composed of both a US and a Mexican section. Each is headed by the engineer or commissioner appointed by his or her respective president. The US section is under the US Department of State, and the Mexican section is under the Mexican Secretariat for Foreign Affairs. And it's really the task of these entities is really to implement the treaty, February 3, 1944, utilization of waters of the Colorado and Tijuana and Rio Grande. And how this is implemented on the ground is that there are a number of minutes to the treaty that are developed. And so the IBWC, what I think is pretty unique in the Colorado River is it's actually established a number of work groups that are include a number of stakeholders to help provide input on those different activities. So there's a work group related to salinity, one on hydrology, another one on environmental work, and then there's also a desalination work group. And one of the key things that most of you may have heard about is looking at improvements of conditions in the Colorado River limit reach. So that's below the border and the associated delta. And a number of years ago, this group had input on the development of a pulse flow that was released essentially downstream into Mexico. And the goal was to get water to flow continuously through to the Gulf of to the Sea of Cortez, or Gulf of California as it's also known. So that has kind of went through the auspices of the IBWC. Okay, now I'm just I got just a few more minutes left. I'm going to just switch gears a little bit and talk about responding to the current crisis. You know, back 4 months ago, before we had this winter, we were really seeing both reservoirs heading towards a dead pool storage, which would mean you're essentially the only water you have is what's released from upstream. There's no storage available to make up any deficit. And so that really has led to a lot of action. I think the wet winter we're experiencing is kind of helped us survive this coming year. So we'll get through this summer, but I think the long-term trends are pretty clear in the basin that we need to look at alternate ways and seeing how we can further reduce uses. So in response to the current drought and crisis in the river, the Department of Interior in October published a notice of intent. And the notice of intent was to develop a supplemental environmental impact statement on the operation of the river. So there's a 2007 guidelines that are in place, a record of decision for that. And that really guides how the river is managed and operated. And unfortunately, or fortunately, those 2007 guidelines have somewhat narrow rules in place for how you can operate. For example, releases from Glen Canyon Dam, you can't just reduce those releases to much more than 7 million acre feet. And so the idea behind this supplemental EIS is to do the environmental work necessary to change those management rules. And they also, part of this was, and this is really to really get us through the next couple of years, and maybe it says 23 and 24, but that also potentially could extend to 2025 and 2026 as well. And part of what was solicited under the notice of intent is that the Department of Interior would like to have information on additional alternatives or feedback on what additional alternatives and measures might be taken. As envisioned under the notice of intent, there will be one alternative will look at no action, so essentially status quo operations. Another alternative will look at something that reclamation would develop, which would be a reservoir operations modification. So essentially, what knobs can they change in the reservoirs, which would mean really ratcheting down releases from Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And then there was a solicitation for additional what was called framework agreement alternatives. So to the extent that stakeholders in the basin could come up with a consensus on a set of actions that would support the goals of the NOI, that was welcomed. And so the basin states in particular tried very hard to come up with a solution that would be a 7-state solution. And then unfortunately that we kind of got to the deadline and we didn't quite get there. There were some things in the what's now called the 6-state proposal that California just couldn't live with, particularly with respect to California's priority rights. And so we came up with there's two proposals. I think there may be a couple other proposals that were submitted as well as part of the comment period. But the key point here is there actually is a lot of common ground between the proposals. Both proposals are looking at protecting Lake Powell from declining below an elevation of 3,500 feet. They're both proposals protect Lake Mead from declining below an elevation of 1,000 feet, and these are under the driest conditions. They're both proposing that reductions in our water use shortages would occur at higher elevations that are currently occurring under the existing rules, and that a lot of rules would be added to really reduce water use once you start hitting those critically low elevations in Lake Mead. And they both had a similar volume of cuts, so shortages, up to 3.3 million acre feet. And if you look at the appropriated use allocated to the lower basins and Mexico combines around 9 million acre feet. So they're both proposing about a 1/3 cut in that over the next few years here, depending on how low obviously Lake Mead and Lake Powell get. But like I said, in the end, we couldn't quite get up across the finish line in a 7-states proposal, but those conversations do continue. We haven't given up yet. We still are discussing a path forward. This slide is one of my last slides, just showing the comparison of those two proposals. So you'll see here that the California proposal in orange and then the 6-state proposal in blue. Similar, the 6-state proposal was proposing cuts sooner. And for this plot, just to situate you, the left y-axis is the target water use reduction. And then the x-axis is the elevation in Lake Mead from high to low. So at 1145 elevation, a certain level of cuts proposed, and then all the way up to 1,000 elevation in Lake Mead, up to that 3.3-ish reduction. So we ended up at the same place. There's a little bit, the 6-state proposal would take cuts much earlier than the California proposal. But as I mentioned, we're still working and trying to get to an agreement. The overall timeline for this SEIS is Reclamation will release a draft in April, so in a few weeks here, and then a fairly quick turnaround time. And then by this summer, they want to have a final SEIS in place with a record of decision. And by that time, it may not be too effective for water year 2023, but particularly in water year 2024, these new rules would be in place to help manage the system. So that's kind of where things are today. And then kind of overlaid on top of this is what happens after 2026. So with the current law of the river, a lot of these agreements, like the 2007 interim guidelines that I mentioned, those expire at the end of 2026. And so there's a need for another longer term operational plan for the reservoirs. And so Reclamation has initiated that process. In June of last year, Department of Interior developed what they called a pre-scoping opportunity for the post-2026 operations. So they had a notice of intent for that, and then it showed, and that was open through September. So they provided the opportunity for the public to comment on the process that should be included in the actual NEPA process for the post-2026 operations, and then also ask for specific feedback on what elements should be included in those operational strategies. So that was developed. This was not a NEPA phase of the project, but it was just a kind of initial scoping for that ultimate NEPA process. And so the summary of that pre-scoping report, if you want to go and see all the comments that were submitted, and you can look at that. That was developed or published in January of this year. And then Reclamation does intend to initiate the formal NEPA process for this post-2026 plan early this year sometime. We haven't seen anything yet, but I'm expecting in the next month or so that we'll see a notice of intent to prepare that EIS. So with that, I'll just have a few concluding thoughts here. In general, the management of the river itself is occurring through these very well-established groups, both at the binational, federal, state, and local agency scale. They're generally, from my perspective, are really program focused. So there's different programs in the river. We don't have like what I would call a Colorado River Commission made up of, elected people from different states and other stakeholders that are actively involved in that. It's more of an ad hoc program by program approach. Reclamation as really the operator and owner of the significant facilities in the basin is the kind of key decision maker for the basin, particularly the lower basin. And as I just mentioned, they have initiated a process to renew those guidelines for Lakes Powell and Meade that will be expiring at the end of 2026. And then there's just a need, I think, moving forward, maybe part of that process to consider how to integrate these different management processes together, including through high communication, cooperation, how you include tribes in this process. I think there's been a lot of discussion on that, how you're including environmental decision-making as well in NGOs, in academics. So I think there's still a lot of discussion going on that end. So with that, I will end my presentation and be happy to answer any questions.
All righty, we have plenty of time for questions. If you still want to submit a question, please submit them to the email address that's provided in the chat line. So Rich, I will read the questions that I have received so far. Let's see, the first question is from Maureen Kuntz. And the question is USBOR exploring alternative means of storing water in the Colorado River system beyond dams?
Any other alternative means of storing water, for example, through groundwater, conjunctive use type projects, those generally occur at the state level. So Arizona has a water bank that actually both California and Nevada have participated in that water bank. And so that is one mechanism. So that's, I don't think reclamation at this point is looking at new storage of any kind in the river, just because it's unclear how that would happen. But I think at the state level, there is a possibility to look at groundwater storage.
Okay, and a second question from Maureen is, what are known environmental effects of the lack of fresh water inflow to the Gulf of California?
Well, I think the issue there is it has to do a lot with the habitat. So when you don't have the flow there, you don't have the water to support the habitat, which affects, bird species, fish species. So that is an ongoing thing. There are a number of activities that have been looked at and are in place right now to look at creating additional habitat. I think one of the things that was learned with that big pulse flow about 7-8 years ago was that that you can't just release a lot of that water that was released just ended up going into the soil and recharging groundwater, but it didn't meet the purpose of the habitat and other items downstream of that. So I think they're looking at more surgical placement of water, so providing water to surgical areas to support specific habitat at specific locations along the river below the border.
All right, thank you. Let's see. This question is from Tony Pizzetti. Can you talk about the issue of considering evaporation? That was a key difference between the two proposals.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and good to hear from you. Yeah, that was a key issue between the California proposal and the six-state proposal. Essentially, the six-state proposal would look at the evaporation along the river, different reaches of the river below Hoover Dam, and assign a loss to the individual contractors in areas according to that reach where those losses occurred. California's perspective was, in a priority-based system, it's generally the juniors that would get cut first, regardless of where those losses occur, and that the seniors would be the last to be cut. But under the proposal with the six states, it kind of reversed that, where the seniors would be required to take significant cuts. So that was a key element that the California agencies just couldn't support.
All right, thanks, Rich. This question is from Anthony Navasero. What historical long-term and short-term water transfer programs are being implemented? And are there new water transfer programs being suggested?
That's a great question. Appreciate that. So, actually, historically, California had taken, there was at one point surplus water in the river, and California actually took more than its 4.4 million acre foot appropriation because of that surplus water. But and this was before the Central Arizona project came online and before demands really started to fill out. But we knew back in the 1980s that surplus water was not going to be available much longer. And so California did undertake a process to reduce our use. We called it the quantitative settlement agreement. And it really was to keep California within its 4.4 million acre foot appropriation. And a key part of that were these long-term transfers, essentially from agriculture to urban areas in California. And so a lot of this was done through canal linings in the Imperial Valley, All-American Canal, and water saved through those water conservation activities was then put through these kind of long-term water transfers to San Diego, Metropolitan, and other users on the river. So those are, and today those long-term transfers are total about 500,000 acre-foot a year. They're implemented through the Imperial Irrigation District, so pretty significant. I'm not familiar with really, I guess the short-term transfers. There is a banking mechanism in Lake Mead called intentionally created surplus, and that is a kind of a year by year decision. And the most well-known one is between Metropolitan and the Palo Verde Irrigation District, where Palo Verde would fallow certain lands on a rotating basis and reduce that demand, and that water is essentially banked in Lake Mead for future uses. And so that's an example, again, from this perspective inside California of a shorter term banking program or a transfer program.
All righty, and Anthony had a second part to the question. What agencies govern over the long-term and short-term water transfer programs in the Colorado River Basin?
So the water transfers in general are done by the individual water using agencies. So those that have the water right and are implementing water conservation activities, they have, for example, Imperial Irrigation District has implemented these long-term transfers in coordination with Metropolitan Water District, Southern San Diego County Water Authority, and others. So it really is the specific water using entity with the contracted supply that is initiating those water transfers. And then those all have to be vetted through the Bureau of Reclamation in terms of the water orders that Reclamation provides to those entities.
All righty. Then the next set of questions is from John Johnston. Could you recap the sticking points between the California proposal and the 6 states proposal? They seem minor and procedural. What is at stake? Who is gaining or losing?
Yeah, and I think it's the question that Tony had asked about those evaporative losses. That seemed to be the really sticking point where from California's perspective, we were being asked to take a much larger shortage based on those evaporative loss assumptions that we feel were appropriate. If you look at the priority of rights in the system, California has been using Colorado River for over 100 years. We have the kind of the higher priority rights in the whole basin from our perspective. And so we felt that that was a bridge too far for us to do that, and that it wasn't consistent with a water rights priority system. So that was, I think, really the key sticking point.
All righty. And John says, seems like a very complicated system of governance. Does it work well, or could it use streamlining? And is the Colorado River Commission needed and useful?
Well, I would say that it's worked well in that we've gotten to this point. You know, it's been over 20 years of dry conditions. We've been able to get through that. We've had a number of agreements. So, for example, in 2019, we did come up with these drought contingency plans to address what was thought of at that time as the necessary reductions in use. Unfortunately, the hydrology has just been so much worse than even they were expecting when those agreements were developed. So I think this kind of a program by program approach is successful. It's getting things done on the river. But we'll see. You know, we have to get through this current crisis here, and then I think part of the long term, these next guidelines, the 2026 post 2026 guidelines, we'll see if there's any suggestions to improve or change the governance. I would say that from the governance perspective, the tribes have been largely left out of a lot of the decisions, or at least that's the perspective. And so there does need to be a way to include the tribes in the decision-making process that wasn't done in the past. And I think those are being actively thought about from Reclamation Interior and how they do that, even in this post-2026 process.
All righty, and there are lots of uses for the water: irrigation, municipal, recreational, species power. How are these balanced when deciding flows and dam operations?
So the uses are really balanced through these different programs I mentioned. So on the environmental side, there's the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. And in the lower basin, there's the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. Those do look at balancing the needs of the system for environment. The water uses are balanced through different operating criteria and guidelines, like those 2007 interim guidelines. So those, it's really this kind of multiple program. That's what I try to touch upon in that paper, is that there's multiple programs in place to try to do that. It's generally a lot of the same stakeholders are all involved in all these different programs. So there is overlap there, but it's not like there's one specific entity or group that is managing all these kind of holistically.
All righty, and it seems like we are in for permanent lower flows. Are there discussions on allocating flows according to uses? For example, irrigating low value crops as opposed to municipal supply?
I think those types of discussions, at least from California's perspective, should happen within the state. So like California has taken steps to coordinate amongst the California water users on how to deal with low conditions. In general, in the basin, the agricultural users are the senior priority and the urban users tend to be the lower priority. In California, we've managed ways to address that through these long-term water transfer programs and fallowing programs are compensated. I think we're looking at doing more of that. But yes, we are dealing with permanent lower flows. We haven't seen, or I haven't seen a perspective yet. I know there's some discussion about looking at specific crop types and trying to manage that. In general, we've been trying to leave that to individual states to address how they want, water uses within and water use reductions to occur within their state.
All right, here's a question from Jeffrey Caspra. Looks like he's from San Jose State University. Does the judicial system play any role in the governance of any new decision-making in the basin?
We hope not. The Arizona and California had a very long, protracted legal dispute over allocation of the river that ended up in, I think it's the 1964 Supreme Court decision that's been updated ever after that. As far as 2006 was, I think, a consolidated decree, but that was begun in the 1950s. So court solutions take very long, and basically once you're in court, people are not talking to each other. So we are hoping that we can get to a solution and with the current crisis that doesn't require going to court, because I think all bets are off once you get to that point.
All righty, and then Anthony circled back with one more question. Also, what is the magnitude, e.g. million acre feet, of those long-term and short-term water transfer programs?
Yeah, so for the California transfers I mentioned, it's the long-term transfers are approximately 500,000 acre feet per year. And we're really, California is really the cutting edge on these long-term transfers. And then the short-term transfers are generally in the range of 50,000 acre feet to 100,000 acre feet per year or so, something along those lines.
All right, here's a question from John Kiantosh. I'm trying to understand the blue and orange bar graph you showed concerning Lake Mead elevations for various withdrawals. Can you comment more on how a given reduction achieves such different water elevations for Lake Mead. Is any of it from modeling differences and or policy differences between the plans? If it is due to modeling differences, are the two groups communicating about using a common model?
Yeah.
Like something adopted by BOR?
Yeah. Great question. Yes, we all are using, and actually that's one thing I would like to highlight. Within the Colorado River Basin, we're very fortunate that reclamation does play this role kind of as the gatekeeper, and they have some very sophisticated models of the operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead for their long-term planning. They call it the Colorado River Simulation System, CRSS. And then for more the shorter period, 2 to 5 years, they have the Colorado River Midterm Modeling System, CRIMS. They're all based on the same kind of software backbone, but they're just operated a little bit differently. So we all are using the same model and basic input assumptions like inflow and uses and so on. So really the difference in that plot, the bar graph of the two proposals was really a policy difference. It's differences in assumptions about how severe the cuts should be, when those cuts should happen, and who would take those cuts. And so that really was a policy difference that was shown in that graph.
All right, thanks. We're just going to go a little bit past the time because we only have one question left. This way we'll tackle all the questions. This question is from Andrew Schwartz. In California, we've had one monster water year, and even after 3 very severe years of drought, many reservoirs within the state are full and making flood releases, acknowledging that groundwater is still way below where it needs to be. What would it take on the Colorado system to get back to more average storage conditions?
So hi Andrew, good to hear from you. On the Colorado system, as I mentioned in the very beginning, so we have these 2 huge, massive reservoirs, 24 million acre feet capacity and 26 million acre feet capacity. And right now we're 25% of that, so about 12.7 million acre feet combined among the two. And so it will take many, many years, winters like the one we just had, or that we're having to fill those back up. It's more, I've heard it kind of compared to more like filling up a groundwater basin than it is a surface storage, because they're so big and the hole is so deep right now that it is going to take many years to get back to kind of a normal full system, if ever. And particularly if we don't come to grips with this basic issue of the demands being too much for the long-term supply, they're never going to fill up. So that's one of the things that's really a key issue that we're facing right now, is how to bring the demands into line with what we think the available supply is.
All right, great. Thanks, Rich. Thanks for thoroughly answering the questions. So on behalf of OWP and all of today's participants, we want to thank you for an excellent presentation on a topic that definitely has people's attention these days. And again, I also want to thank all of our listeners, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Take care.
Thanks for the opportunity.
You
Thank
bet.
you, Rich.